Ion Fury. You know, I was really reluctant to give this game a good review since they totally ripped off the name of my high school punk metal band, Iron Fury. That's a joke, by the way. But they did rip off the thrills and excitement I used to get playing those twitchy, irreverent, blast every enemy into a pixelated paste-style shooters in the 90s. This game is a passionate tribute to games like Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, Blood, and especially Duke Nukem. The connections to Duke Nukem run deep, actually. Ion Fury is actually a prequel to a game called Bombshell, which was originally conceived as a Duke Nukem game. The main villain is voiced by John St. John, the voice of Duke Nukem, and the game is powered by an updated version of the original build engine, the engine used for Duke Nukem 3D, as well as Shadow Warrior and Blood. And with a few modernized quality of life improvements, it runs amazingly well and is a true delight to play. I do have a few beefs with it, but overall, it's a truly great, well-designed game that doesn't just rely on nostalgia to get the job done. Ion Fury was designed to be an old-school shooter through and through, from the 2D character sprites to the title and story screens to the way the game mocks you when you try to exit, to the old-school quick-save and quick-load mechanics that are incredibly handy, but God help you if you mix up those buttons. It's got some modern flavor and does a few things that older game engines simply weren't capable of, but it really doesn't try to be anything more than the classic games that it emulates. It simply ices the cake with things like spent ammunition shells, fully reflective mirrors, kicking around the disembodied heads of your enemies, a third-person mode, headshots that do extra damage, elemental damage, destructible environments, dual wielding, and the ability to check out your own butt on a surveillance feed. It's also got a badass, foul-mouthed female protagonist and is packed with irreverent humor, inside jokes, and gaming references.
Imagine the future, 'cause you're not in it.
You can hardly toss an offensively labeled lotion bottle without hitting some reference to some other classic game. Ion Fury's artwork and music are amazing. The game takes place in a dystopian, somewhat cyberpunk future that drips with as much personality and character as the game's protagonist, Shelley Bombshell Harrison. Shelley is well acted, and her intermittent commentary and sporadic one-liners make her a very entertaining character to play. The villain, Haskell, is also well-voiced and entertaining, and he adds to the conflict and momentum of the story as he taunts you and reacts to your actions throughout the game. Like most 90s-era action games, the story can be summed up in a few paragraphs, and the entire game is about you accomplishing a singular goal. In this case, you're trying to find and take down the bad guy who attacked your city and caused you to spill your drink. Also, he killed a bunch of people and is creating mutants and cyborgs through human experimentation, but that drink though. You really needed that drink. To that end, you move from point A to point B on each map, sometimes seeking out keys or buttons to open locked doors, but mostly just killing everything that stands in your way. Sounds simple enough, but the levels are large and well designed, and there are plenty of them. The main campaign has 7 zones, each with multiple levels. In total, this took me somewhere between 15 and 20 hours to complete, on the 2nd level of difficulty with a moderate amount of time spent looking for secrets. If you enjoy the type of gameplay that it offers, I would say that this one is definitely worth the price. One aspect of the level design that I particularly appreciated were the shortcuts that would progressively unlock. After fighting your way through a lengthy section of level, you're often able to unlock a door or lower a ladder that lets you quickly travel back to a previous point in the level, and vice versa. This is incredibly convenient when you're backtracking to look for pickups or secrets. And speaking of secrets, the game is absolutely packed with them. The larger levels typically have a dozen or more, and they are very well hidden. Sometimes the map gives you hints about where secrets are located, and sometimes you can outright see the hidden area just out of reach, but you can't for the life of you figure out how to get there. Some secrets are found by blasting holes through walls, performing Jackie Chan stunts on the outside of a huge skyscraper, solving weird puzzles, or literally walking through a picture that isn't really there. Or by just pulling a barely visible lever that opens a random door somewhere else in the level. This game is truly a completionist's dream, or nightmare. Take your pick. The levels are large and varied with tons of detail, and the settings range from tight facility corridors to underground tunnels to wide-open outdoor areas. Some of my favorite locations include a city area where you can explore a mall after hours, and a large country estate. Now, not all of the levels are stellar. There's a moving train level that was kinda meh, and some sewage-filled sewers that were pretty bland. But I wouldn't call any of the levels bad. None of them felt tedious and repetitive. At no point was I saying to myself, man, I wish this level would just end so I can get onto something better, which is something I've definitely said while playing old shooters before. And only once did I get stuck because I missed pulling a lever and couldn't figure out where the hell I was supposed to go. Besides the first-person shooters that this game is based on, many of the in-game areas reminded me of other old-school games that I love. Games like Half-Life, Jedi Knight, and the original Deus Ex. In short, I'm giving Ion Fury top marks for level design. And now for the combat. The combat system is pretty standard for this style of game. It's about running and gunning with a focus on speed and power rather than precision and strategy. There are rare occasions when your enemies are not yet aware of you, when you can plan a more tactical move, but there's really no stealth to speak of. It's all about making quick decisions as you run full tilt and dive in and out of cover, desperately trying to obliterate your enemies before they obliterate you. I can't verify this 100%, but it appears that this game uses a virtual dice roll damage system, which adds some randomness to the damage that each attack deals. Sometimes it takes 2 shots to take down an enemy, sometimes it takes 3, that kind of a thing. Again, this was pretty standard in old shooters. Aside from headshots doing extra damage, which is a nice touch, it doesn't appear to matter where you hit the enemy. What matters is that you hit them, and vice versa. You've got 8 different weapons to choose from, which isn't a ton, but each one does have a secondary firing mode, and I found that every weapon's primary and secondary modes were useful in certain situations. Throughout the game, I was constantly switching weapons. There was no one-size-fits-all option that was good in every circumstance. This is a major plus in my opinion. It adds to the strategy aspect of the gameplay. Unfortunately, I did encounter some technical problems that limited the usefulness of certain weapons. Proximity mines had a bad habit of being triggered by enemies through walls, which often ended up killing me as I tried to place them. Also, you don't seem to be able to place them on floors, which is weird. You can toss them, but this makes them go off immediately. They'd have been much more useful if they'd been placeable on floors. The ion bow has good long-distance precision, which makes it good for sniping, but in some situations the weapon's aim seemed to get really confused. I'd be aiming directly at an enemy's head, but the bolt would angle upward or downward, missing the spot I was aiming for by a wide margin. Now, I am intending to report these as bugs to the developers, so if you're watching this a while after release, hopefully these problems have been fixed. Now, the bowling bombs are a really neat weapon, but I did feel like they were a bit overpowered, especially since they have the ability to home in on enemies if you take a second to charge them up. Now granted, you can only carry so many, but you can find replacements all over the place and it only takes 2 or 3 of them to clear out a room full of enemies. The grenades you can launch from your shotgun, however, those were awesome, and they have a really wide blast radius, which means you have to be really careful with them in close quarters. It's a realistic limitation that makes you think twice before using them. Overall, the weapons are decent, but they're also kind of bland. You've got a revolver, SMGs, shotgun, chain gun, an electric baton for melee attacks. Everything's pretty standard. I feel like there was room for more creativity here, especially considering the setting and the over-the-top nature of the game. I'd like to see a few more weapons with unique effects, like perhaps something along the lines of the shrink ray from Duke Nukem 3D. Maybe something that confuses your enemies into attacking each other, or some kind of magnetic device that messes with the ones who have metal parts. I'm literally just spitballing as I write this, but my point is, this is a world where people have cybernetic parts and disembodied heads fly around on drones. Yet the guns are extremely ordinary. I really think more could have been done with them without disrupting the old-school feel of the game. Outside of weapons and med packs, I didn't find the items in the game terribly useful. There's a portable radar system, a consumable item that, when activated, temporarily shows you the locations of enemies and pickups. I mostly use these to help me find secrets, which usually contain item stashes that would show up on the radar screen. I didn't find it very useful for combat, but that could just be my playstyle. Beyond that, you can find temporary power-ups lying around, damage boosters and such, which I rarely bothered with since they're, well, temporary, and by the time I found them I had usually killed most of the enemies in the area anyway. I think the most interesting item I came across was a pair of boots that let you double jump. Once again, these lasted only 30 seconds, but you could return to the spot where you found them and pick them up again after they ran out. Finding these usually meant that there were secrets or other interesting areas nearby that required the double jump in order to reach them. Now, I totally get why the developers wouldn't want you to have this ability all the time, but still, would have been fun, just saying. Alright, let's talk about the enemies. This is where I have the most complaints. Now, I don't dislike any of the enemy designs I encountered in the game, but there were quite a few moments of, oh, more of these guys again, okay. This was especially prevalent in the first half of the game. You have a decent variety of enemies thrown at you right away, and then a long pause before you see any more new ones. Now, in no way did I assess this scientifically, but that is my subjective perception. I do have to say, though, that when the game does introduce a new enemy, it does it really well. There are some pretty awesome enemy encounter moments later on in the game that I won't spoil here. Now, I honestly think the game would have benefited immensely from adding one more enemy type, some kind of officer or security guard that looks like they belong in an office setting. You traveled through a few labs and offices and facilities, and sometimes you'd see guys in tactical armor or robed cultists standing at computer terminals trying to look like office staff, and it just looked kind of funny. Having some kind of enemy that looked more like they belonged there, even if they're weaklings with pistols, really would have added to the aesthetic. Beyond this, a few additional sub-varieties of the existing enemies could have added a lot to the game as well. For example, the robed cultists are very cool enemies, especially the red ones, whose eyes you can see glowing from far off. There are 2 varieties of cultist with 2 different robe colors, but why only 2? By changing the robe color and giving them different weapons, you could very easily create additional versions of this enemy that would make things just that much more interesting. I'd love to see one that used bowling bombs. I think that would actually create some interesting encounters. Anyway, my biggest complaint about the enemies, actually about the game in general, is that the enemy AI sucks. Granted, it's about as good as enemy AI was in your average 90s shooter, but this is not an aspect of old games that I feel nostalgia for. I mean, the enemies in this game won't even open doors, they'll just run around like morons on the other side of the wall. Which was fine back in the olden days when you couldn't see what they were doing, but it looks ridiculous when there's a fully transparent glass window giving you a front row seat to the freak show. But even when there is a clear path for them to get to you, they seem to have some trouble finding it. It's as if they want to take the most direct path to you without accounting for walls or stuff that might be in the way. Now, it crossed my mind that this might be a result of the difficulty level I was playing on, so I did a bit of experimenting. On harder difficulties, the enemies definitely got more aggressive, but they didn't seem to get any smarter as far as pathfinding goes. I really don't see why even the dumbest enemy can't figure out how to go through the door 10 feet away rather than repeatedly smashing their face against the wall. I realize it's possible that the developers did this intentionally, because that's the way it was back in the day, but I really think this is an aspect of the game that could have used some modernization. Finally, boss fights. The boss fights were pretty good, actually, and I like that some of the bosses that you beat earlier in the game return later as non-boss enemies in normal levels. There was one point where an earlier boss got reused as a boss again, and I thought it would have been nice to encounter a new boss at that point, but that's a small gripe. As for the final boss, I'll try not to spoil too much here, but I do have mixed feelings about it. It was a pretty awesome fight, and in many ways a great climax to the game, but to me it didn't really feel like a final boss. Yes, there was an enemy you were trying to destroy, but it was more of an objective that needed completing while waves upon waves of minions tried to stop you. It was a pretty massive and entertaining fight, but a little anticlimactic at the same time. Overall, though, Ion Fury is a blast. There's room for improvement, sure, but considering the size of the team that worked on this game and the limitations of the engine they were using, this game is an incredible piece of work. I hope they make more, and I hope to see more adventures with Shelly Bombshell Harrison in the future. Incidentally, the level editor is available right now, straight from the developers, and Steam Workshop support is expected very soon. So, if you like user-created content in games or enjoy making content yourself, this may be one you want to check out. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, sub, and hit that notification bell, and then check out some of these other videos. Find the link to our Discord server and other important stuff in the description below.